The local myth, if you will, is that the sea is haunted with ghosts. And most, if not all, the disciples were from the area, so they would have known that this is a haunted sea. So when they see Jesus, they immediately assume, oh no, it's a ghost. Silly disciples. Hi, and welcome back to Learn the Bible with Nathan, where we build a relationship with Jesus one chapter at a time. Today we're going to be going over Matthew chapter 14. For those of you who have been following the podcast, today I'm actually going to try changing up the format of the podcast a bit. So if you like the new format, please let me know that in the comments section. Otherwise, tell me to go back to the old way. I'm fine with either. So let's start by reading the text. Matthew chapter 14. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John the Baptist beheaded in prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl. And she brought it to her mother, and his disciples came and took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. So I'm going to go into some detail on this first part of the chapter before moving on. So firstly, what a crazy story. King Herod is having sex with his brother's wife, and John the Baptist calls him out on it, and he gets thrown in prison. And then Herodias has her own daughter tempt the king in some sort of weird dancing way into giving her whatever she wants. And Herodias convinces her daughter to ask for the head of John the Baptist. So some interesting things here. Firstly, when you think about this story, some king having sex with his brother's wife. The first thing that comes to my mind is the victim in this story seems like Herodias. I automatically assume that the woman here is guiltless, and the terrible and awful king is taking her and doing what he wants with her, just like an evil king. But there's definitely more to this story. Now, I'm not saying in any way that Herod is a good guy, but it seems like Herodias is the evil mastermind behind this whole thing. But Herod in this story doesn't seem quite as conniving. Even at the beginning of the chapter, Herod thinks that Jesus is the resurrected John the Baptist. In saying this, the king is admitting that John has miraculous powers. And of course, so does Jesus. So one could almost assume that Herod might even have some belief in the ministry of John the Baptist and of Jesus. But there's a consistent theme throughout this story. Firstly, he imprisoned John the Baptist for Herodias' sake. And then he didn't put John the Baptist to death because of his fear of the people. And then later on, he fulfills his oath to Herodias' daughter because he was in the presence of his guests. The constant theme here with Herod is that his actions are motivated by fear of others. Now, I know many of us probably can't say that we are guilty of sleeping with our brother's wife, but we can probably all empathize with this idea of having fear of others. Maybe the Lord is calling me to do something, but I'm afraid of what my friends are going to think, or what my parents are going to think, or what my boss is going to think, or even what my wife is going to think. And the big takeaway from this section of the chapter for me is that fear of man always leads to sin. Maybe King Herod didn't want to harm John the Baptist, but he was motivated by fear of others more. I pray that you take away from these scriptures that fear of others only leads to death, but reverence for the Lord leads to life. All right, moving on. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But then Jesus said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They said to him, "We only have 5 loaves here and 2 fish." Then he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking up loaves and the 2 fish, he looked into heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides the women and the children. So this is a very famous miracle that Jesus did. He took a couple of fish and some loaves of bread, and he multiplied it to feed thousands and thousands of people. So I have 2 major takeaways from this portion. Firstly, at the beginning of this section, Jesus is really sad. I mean, he should be sad. His cousin was just killed. So he goes away to a desolate place to be alone with the Father and to grieve. But when the crowds found him, he had compassion on them. This is once again an example of how Jesus prioritizes the needs of others over the needs of himself, which, if you're keeping track, is the exact opposite of what King Herod does. Jesus doesn't have fear of others, he has compassion on them. And although he's certainly struggling with pain and grief at the moment, his compassion for others takes precedence. That's just awesome. Now, the second thing that stood out to me is Jesus' miracle. He took the loaves and the fish and he multiplied them. A key takeaway for me here is that the disciples had a couple of loaves and a couple of fish, and they had to give it to Jesus first. You see, Jesus didn't make food appear out of thin air. He multiplied the food that was given to him from the disciples. So what's our takeaway from that? This is a good example of how we should serve Jesus in our daily lives. Now, this is not true 100% of the time. God has definitely done miraculous things despite what we do. But more often than not, Jesus asks us to give him what we have, and then he takes that and does miraculous things with it. An immediate example that I think of is if I have it on my heart to share the Gospels with a friend or a coworker or somebody like that, but I have fear because if I share the Gospels with them, they might ask me some questions, and maybe I don't have the answers to all those questions. So the human tendency would be to shy away and not share the gospel with your friend because I have so little to give. My knowledge of Jesus is so small compared to others, but Jesus is only asking you to give what you have. Same thing with the disciples. Jesus didn't tell the disciples to find enough food to feed 5,000 men plus women and children. He said, "Give me what you have and I will do the rest." So encouraging. Let's keep reading. Immediately he made the disciples get into a boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. After he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on a mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way away from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, and they said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And then Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come out to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and he began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took a hold of him, saying, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." This is another super famous miracle that happens in this chapter. Couple of takeaways. Firstly, when the disciples saw Jesus walking on the water, they immediately thought he was a ghost. Well, why did they think he was a ghost? That seems a little strange. The reason they thought Jesus was a ghost is because they were on the Sea of Galilee. And back then, the people in the region thought that the Sea of Galilee was literally haunted. Now, we talked about the crazy winds and waves that happen in the Sea of Galilee a couple of episodes ago, so I won't go into that again. But, long story short, there's massive storms that can appear out of nowhere on the Sea of Galilee, and the result of that is that many people over time have died in the Sea of Galilee. Because so many people have died there, the local myth, if you will, is that the sea is haunted with ghosts. And most, if not all, the disciples were from the area, so they would have known that this is a haunted sea. So when they see Jesus, they immediately assume, "Oh no, it's a ghost." Silly disciples. Now, the next part that I find super fascinating is the way that Peter has faith. So Peter asks Jesus to tell him to come out and walk on the water with him. And then he does, and Peter walks on the water. But then Peter is afraid of the wind, and he begins to sink. So what's my big takeaway here? This is a great reminder that faith is not a one and done thing. Rather, faith is something that you practice over and over again over time. And that's certainly true with Peter here. Peter had enough faith to step out and actually walk on the water. But then the waves and the wind came, and his faith was lost, and he began to sink. Jesus, of course, rescues him. How often has that happened in our life? Like the Lord speaks to us, and we have faith to do something, but then over time, we kind of lose faith for those things. This is a great reminder for me that faith is something that we need to contend for over and over and over again. And I know for myself that my faith can diminish over time if I'm not constantly asking and praying Jesus to fill me up and to give me more and more faith. What a great reminder. Last part of the chapter here. And when they crossed over, they came to a land at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they went around to all that region and brought to him all who were sick, and implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment, and as many as touched it were made well. It is awesome to see as the book of Matthew continues, the faith of the people around Jesus raising and raising and raising. And in this example, the people had so much faith that they knew that if I only touched his clothes, I would be healed. And of course, their faith healed them. Awesome. Well, that's Matthew chapter 14. Join us in the next episode where we're going to go over Matthew chapter 15. I'd love to hear your comments, especially about the new format. I'd really appreciate that. But until I see you in the next episode, Jesus loves you, and shalom, shalom.